Hello, hello. Welcome to the Remote Work Movement podcast. My name is Gonçalo Hall, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to this fantastic podcast, or at least we hope so. Today's guest is Liam Martin, the CMO of Time Doctor, one of the biggest thought leaders in the remote workspace and co-founder at Running Remote, is joining us for the episode where we talked about remote management, asynchronous work, running remote, the conference coming to Portugal in April, and the future of work. We touched so many themes, you definitely can't miss this one. This episode is also brought to you by Nomadex. Yes, Nomadex is a community brand that works with physical governments, and we are currently in Madeira, Cabo Verde, Lisbon, and Brazil. If you want to know more about our global communities or join us in any of these beautiful locations, just check nomadex.com. We also run a Discord server with people from all over the world. The access is 100% free, so you can just register at our website, nomadex.com, and you can join our movements. So, without further ado, please welcome Sir Liam Martin. On this computer, that's nice. That's nice. Okay, let's do this. So, Mr. Liam, thank you so much for coming to the Remote Work Movement podcast. It's your second time on the podcast, but you don't remember the first one because it was 2 years ago, and we are just recording our second season after some crazy years on the remote workspace.
I remember that clearly, Gonzalo. I don't think that you understand that I have a memory like an elephant. And I remember you were in a building that it looked like you were in some type of old cabin from like a horror movie or something like that. And and we were chatting and you were very excited. And I think you were just getting in to the podcast at that point. I might have been one of your first guests, or at least you were telling me I was one of your first guests. Sure. Sometimes podcast people, they butter you up like every single time. Wow, great podcast. This is an amazing podcast. This is going to be great. So I'm always a little bit apprehensive about the positive feedback loop from podcast hosts. But yeah, it was, that's what I remember from that podcast. But you're right. In the last 2 years, I mean, in terms of remote work years, the last 2 years, there's been more stuff happening in the last 2 years than in the last 20 years. So we've got a lot to talk about.
Yes. So the first part that we want to touch is exactly that. So we went from a pandemic that accelerated for 10 years what we were trying to build before. We saw companies announcing that they were going full remote. Then we saw companies announcing they're going everybody back to the office. Then we saw Elon Musk, Mr. Elon Musk, saying he's completely against remote work. And then we saw Elon Musk saying, well, I'm actually favor remote work and I'm closing one of my offices. So with all this, with all the crazy happening, in your opinion, where are we actually today in terms of remote work implementation? Because we see companies going 100% remote, companies coming back to the office. Realistically, what can we think about what's the place where we are at? That's a remote work implementation.
Yeah, I think let's take a step back for a second. So January of 2020, we're at about 3.5% of the US workforce working remotely. By March of 2020, we were at approximately 45% of the US workforce working remotely. Throughout that entire process, up until approximately 3 months ago, where we were floating at about 35% of the US workforce working remotely, but only 7% of those people were fully remote, and the rest of that group were hybrid. So we've got a really interesting situation now where the majority of the workers are hybrid. All of those workers don't want to be hybrid. About 86% of them say they would actually prefer to be able to work majority remote than being dragged into the office 4 days a week and getting 1 day off to be able to work remotely. You've got Elon Musk that says, hey, remote work is dumb, in which case we had the entire industry kind of step back. And then 3 months later, he works that back because frankly, he actually just wants to get out of all of his corporate leases. For all of his office space. So we're kind of in a bit of a pickle here. I would probably say this is the first time that I've ever seen remote work desire drop off. So I've seen a continuous uptick over the last 20 years for remote work at various rates. You know, the data before COVID was showing a growth rate of approximately 10 to 15%. year over year for people working remotely. But again, we're talking about 3.5, 4.5% of the US workforce pre-COVID. Then we jump up to 45% and we drop back down to now essentially 35%. But that number is a little disingenuous because only 7% are fully remote at this point. So it's a place that is very scary, I think, for the remote work movement. And again, I think on this podcast, I'm going to declare my bias, but I'm pro remote work. I think there's a lot of data sources that show you that remote work is the more successful way to work. It just requires a different way of working, which is, I think, the critical piece that we're trying to teach at the Running Remote conference as an example, to show people that it's not just about recreating the office at home. It's actually about creating a new way to work, a new methodology, a new management mindset that you have to be able to implement to be able to deploy remote. And most corporates, most executives are not really interested in making that shift at this point, or at least based off of what I've seen, it's been very difficult for them to be able to make this shift up until this point.
Exactly. I remember I was at the last Running Remote in Montreal, and I was speaking with some of my heroes that are now common friends, like Chase Remington from from Doist, Laura Ferrer, and Darren Murph. And I was saying, I think my job is done. Like, I think my job for the remote work movement is done. Like, we are all remote now. It's like, Gonzalo, we are not even starting. And what they defend is actually your vision. And they convinced me of that, of course. That's why we are doing the second season of this podcast. Many companies did implement remote work, but they did this pandemic remote work where most people are now, most of my friends are complaining they have too many meetings. They are complaining they work too many hours. They are complaining they are tired of working from home because there is so many limitations in our belief of what is remote work. They see remote work as home office. They have to be stuck at home forever. And here I am. I hate to work from home, right? What can we do to help these companies? What are these companies getting wrong about remote work that is leading to these complaints from their workers?
Well, your very first point actually alludes to the number one problem. Remote work, in my opinion, and again, this comes from me writing this book a few months ago, which is Running Remote. I wanted to actually call it async, which is where I'm going with this. A lot of the remote pioneers, people that were remote before the pandemic, of which we knew a lot of those people because that was our conference existed before the pandemic. The one singular piece that they all had in common is what I'm calling asynchronous management, which is the ability to be able to manage people without directly synchronously interacting with them. So right now we're in a synchronous call. We can communicate live. The people that are listening to this podcast are consuming that information asynchronously. And that's effectively how the vast majority of successful remote companies operate. They exist in a world in which they don't really jump onto Zoom calls all that often. They don't really communicate through Google Meet, or they don't get constant pings on Slack or Microsoft Teams every single day. It's a much more specific way of working to focus and maximize every individual worker's autonomy towards deep work, meaning the ability to actually get hard problems solved inside of a business. Because when you look at a corporation from a first principles perspective, a company, what is a company supposed to do? It's supposed to innovate and solve difficult problems faster than its competitors. If you can do that, then you win every single time. And the way that you do that is not necessarily through synchronous collaboration. It's through asynchronous collaboration. And there's lots of systems and processes that you talk about in the book and at the Running Remote conference that actually help facilitate that. But this is the number one barrier. I don't know if you heard this statistic. Do you know companies that transitioned to remote during the pandemic, what percentage of their work week do you think that they spend on video meetings?
I would say 40%. It's very high for
A little
sure.
bit higher than that. It's
Wow.
67%.
So they basically don't work.
67% of their workday. They don't work. They meet people to talk about the work that they're going to do.
Or they should do, or they should be doing.
Yes. So whenever you're in a meeting, there is an incorrect correlation between the concept that meeting is work. And actually, what you should do is you should say meeting is to prepare for individual autonomous deep work. It's collecting the information, the pieces that I need in order to actually work in a on my own to solve those difficult problems inside of companies. So I came up with a definition of asynchronous management, which was an asynchronous organization is any company that spends less than 10% of their work week working synchronously. So out of their 40 hours, they spend effectively 4 hours, or if we're talking about the 4-day work week, they're 32 hours, they're spending 3.2 hours in synchronous communication with their team. And all of that other time is spent doing asynchronous communication. Right now, even inside of some of my companies, we're still not at that 10% rate. We actually float around 21% right now in terms of internal communication, just to be completely open and honest with people. But when I did a case study, I looked at 20 companies for the book. I didn't include this in the book because it was super embarrassing. I tried to get those 20 companies to go towards that 10% target. Three succeeded, seven reduced the amount of time that they had in synchronous meetings to asynchronous work, and 10 held the amount of synchronous work that they were doing or increased the amount of synchronous work that they were doing. So, by my definition, a massive failure. And there were a lot of interesting variables that kind of connected to why that didn't work. To your point, it was process documentation. It was querying that process documentation. It was executives that really weren't on board with this new and weird alien concept of, okay, what do you mean I don't talk to my people directly? Well, yeah, you do talk to them. You just talk to them asynchronously. And those are the major pieces that just didn't allow for me to get those companies over the hump. And I think this is the number one factor that is impacting the success of companies that want to become remote or are currently in that current transitory stage of maybe I'm doing a little bit of hybrid, maybe I'm not. It's not really working out because they didn't understand that their operating system of how they run their company needs to change.
Yeah, it's more, way more than where you work. I think that's the misconception, right? Remote work is perceived as where you work, and it's not that. It's so much more. It's also how you work. And I think most companies got exactly stuck on the where and forget the how. There's this really cool,
Mm.
actually, tweet that I saw today, which is a Google Calendar link. But every time you invite someone, it calculates the cost per hour. I'll show you, but people. So
Oh,
basically
wow.
says the whole cost per hour, so you know exactly how much a meeting costs. And imagine all these all hands meeting that companies have going to six figures very easily, and this can be actually a factor to convince managers understanding how much money they're leaving on the table for every meeting they have. Maybe a very interesting way to also convince them that that's not maybe the best use of their time.
I think there's a deeper, again, I'm going to say this, but it's probably going to not necessarily be the best for some people. There is a there is an unconscious, deeper reason as to why people want to do all of these meetings. When you think about the average MBA type guy, right? 6'5", white, looks like Captain America, goes to the gym all the time, super charismatic, cool guy. Asynchronous management takes all of his advantages, the ability to convince other people of his perspective away. If you think about the way that a company runs, again, going through a first principles perspective, what's the most effective way to be able to come to a conclusion for decision making? Well, it's to remove charisma bias, number one, right? Just because I'm more charismatic does not automatically mean that my ideas are better or worse than yours. In reality, actually, the vast majority of the time, because I've spent more time being charismatic and extroverted, my ideas are not as well thought out. So therefore, we should be equalizing everything. And like we have meetings on Asana, as an example. We have silent meetings where we put up issues inside of our meeting document and we just start commenting on them asynchronously. And we come to conclusions and we clear that ticket. And if we have less than 3 tickets before that meeting starts, we don't do the meeting. And it's literally that simple. And it's just automatically deleted from my Google Calendar, right? It's such a simpler way of operating a business And the people that hate that the most are the charismatic Captain America, guys.
That's
Those guys hate it because they don't have the same power that they had 3 years ago.
And many times those are the middle managers that are trying to push people back to the office. They need to recover this feeling of being the central person in the conversation. Not
When
always,
I
but
was,
sometimes.
yeah, when I was studying asynchronous organizations, a statistic that completely blew me away was asynchronous organizations on average have a 50% thinner managerial layer than their on-premise counterparts. So half those managers are no longer needed inside of these organizations. And those managers know that. If
Yeah.
they're really being true to themselves, they understand that. And that's why there's this pushback to the office because they're recognizing I'm a horse and it's 1915 and the first Model T just rolled off the production line and shit, I better fight as fast as I possibly can to kill this because management is going bye-bye. I actually don't think that management is the right term that we need to use any longer. It's more leadership. It's being able
Mm.
to say, Gonzalo, how are you today? How are you feeling? I know all your metrics, right? Because the platform is the manager. All of those data points that we've put into the system are already being collected, and everyone else in the organization can have access to that information. But more importantly, how are you doing? Because that's actually what you need to investigate. Because you could say, hey, you know what? My wife is about to give birth and I'm really stressed out about it and I'm not really super focused on my work. Okay, cool. I understand that. Listen, here's what we should do. We should really have you just take the next 4 weeks off because it's totally not going to be a good productive use of your time where you're in a flow state where you can work productively.
Yes.
Let's have you take that time off and let's have you focus on your family, and then come back refreshed and ready to actually get back into it. Those are the things that's like the last piece of information that a manager goes after inside of asynchronous organizations. It's the first thing that a manager goes after.
It's very ironic that remote work is a lot of times for people that just implemented or they are starting, they think remote work is less human. Although when we go in and you did in the book inside these companies that are doing this for a long time, remote companies and full remote companies, full distributed companies are usually more human centric than actually some office companies, which is very ironic that many managers are afraid of losing their people, their culture when they go remote. Once we see the real remote companies doing this for a long time, for 10 years, it's actually the opposite. It's like they are much more human centric. They care more about people, not all, but all the leaders we know in this space. I see that they actually deep care about people, and people feel more part of a team than many times just for being inside the office, which is way more competitive. It's very interesting. And I also like the idea of the brainstorm, 3-day asynchronous brainstorm. I think I learned from Lila in Muro. They do asynchronous brainstorms of 3 days, exactly to eliminate what you mentioned, the charisma bias. So anyone can give ideas, but not everybody will be brave enough or have the right mentality to speak up in the meeting, especially in these crowded Zoom meetings, right? It's chaos. You need to be brave sometimes.
Yeah, I really believe that we're seeing the rise of the introverted leader. And
I love
that
it.
is starting to happen right now, where again, we go back to Captain America versus the wallflower that's kind of sitting in the back corner of the boardroom that doesn't really want to tango with Captain America because frankly, I don't I don't have the skills to be able to do it. I can't communicate in that way with those types of individuals. And I'm not trying to be offensive towards those individuals. They have a huge skill set, right? If you want to be able to convince somebody, like if you're in sales as an example, that's a
Yes.
huge asset to have. It's just not who I am fundamentally. And so on something like Asana as an example, I can communicate the way that I want to communicate. I can think about my ideas. I can read all of the information that's currently been presented, all the videos, all that kind of stuff. I can I can process that information and then I can provide a meaningful response to that conversation. And
Yes.
this is the thing that I think, I mean, if I were to do that in the moment, I'd just be completely incapable of doing it. But because I can take some time to think about my thoughts, I can be a lot more eloquent through text than I can in synchronous verbal communication.
Yeah, for me, I'm an extrovert, and that happens so many times. All my best ideas are usually somewhere around the shower, at least around water.
Hmm,
All my big ideas are in the shower, so I actually sometimes have to go to my phone and actually put a voice memo so I don't forget about my ideas because my memory is also not great. But yeah,
right.
it's never on the brainstorm where I have the best ideas. It's when I disconnect, I relax, and then I actually let it process. It's very interesting. So my question is actually for all these companies that are doing it wrong, like the same with documentation. Sometimes it's hard to start. We see big
Mhm.
resistance towards asynchronous work. What would
Yep.
be the first step? How can they start moving to become more asynchronous? Because it's not like day and night. It's a process, right?
Yeah. First step is to read chapter 8 of Running Remote, to be completely honest with you.
Very
That's the
important.
first one. But then right after that, what I would propose that people do, which is basically chapter 8, is prepare for an asynchronous week. So there's so many things that you can do in terms of asynchronous management, right? The process documentation, the way that you communicate, your cadences, the documentation of success or failure inside of asynchronous organizations. There's all of those pieces that have to be done. But fundamentally, let's just forget about all of that. What I would suggest to people and what I suggest to a lot of clients is prepare for an async week. So, what does that mean? Well, it means getting the minimum amount of information together in order for your organization to not have to communicate synchronously for 1 week and still continue on operations of the business. Survey before that occurs. So, talk to your employees, do like an NPS score as an example for the organization, ask them how they're feeling about asynchronous work versus synchronous work, and then survey right afterwards. I actually have a templated survey example inside of the book.
Mm-hmm. I'm checking the book right now. It says
Every
the article 8, the chapter is the Sync Leader Guide to End Management. So definitely that's the one we
That's
have
it.
to read.
Yes, that's where we're at. So the piece that I have found is that I have not found a single company where the employees didn't love async week. Like, and I've surveyed close to 100 at this point.
Wow.
All the employees love async week. The management, generally, it's about a 50-50 split. I would almost kind of drive that directly down the middle of over leveraged managers love async week. Under leveraged managers, managers that are basically just kind of they're redundant to the process, don't like it because they recognize that, hey, I can't have my 2 hour call with Gonzalo every 2 days about how he's doing in terms of putting together this podcast. Like, that's complete BS.
Yes.
In that amount of time, you could have put out 6 more podcasts, right? Like,
Yes.
what's the goal of you? What is the true goal for you as an individual as it applies to this podcast project? It means put out meaningful podcasts that you can go very deep with the guests and then promoting those podcasts so that people can get access to that information. That should be your only job. And there should be metrics that kind of surround that, like the average amount of downloads per week. That would be a metric that I would put up that you would automatically have reported on inside of my dashboard if I was your manager. How many downloads per week? How many social mentions? Do you go viral on TikTok and Reels? What are the views on that? What is the attribution rate from those social media sites back to the main podcast? Then out of that, how many emails have I generated off of that particular podcast? All of those metrics would just be documented. I really wouldn't need to talk to you unless it was going horribly wrong. And then we need to say, like, should we continue on with this podcast or should we stop it because the ROI of this activity is probably not positive? I mean, that's honestly a 1 hour call a month, if that.
Yes. If that.
So the reality is that that's not what most managers do. They sit and they think and they talk and they don't really focus on what's truly important, which is the underlying factors why you may not be performing very well in a podcast project, let's say, is that You're expecting a child relatively soon, and that might be on top of mind. And then we can solve for that versus actually hammering you on your numbers and saying, why did we only get 10,000 downloads for this last episode? Why didn't we get 20,000? It's like you could provide a whole bunch of bullshit answers, to be honest with you, or we could really go to the deep core issue, which is I'm distracted by these other things, and I need to actually go in and take the next month off to be able to be more successful long term.
Yeah, measure what matters, not just to do calls to see how things are. The status
That's
update
it.
calls, right? I love it.
Yeah.
And you touch here. I want to stop a little bit talking about companies, although this is very exciting, and the book is very about the company side. I want to talk a little bit about the future. If we are able to implement this vision of work, if we are able to have more synchronous work, probably be more productive with the synchronous work, what would be the outcomes for how and where people live, in your opinion, that excites you? There is many outcomes, but what outcomes are you very excited for if this will happen?
One of the biggest things that I'm excited for is cities will cease to be a place to work and they'll start to be a place to live. So the most important variable will be, do I like to live here? Not my job is here, which is
Yes.
what the majority of people do when they choose a city to live in. And it's kind of ironic that they choose a city to live in that they don't want to live in, right? Like if you look at a lot of these cities, I mean, New York as an example, beautiful city. I love New York. Would I want to live there for the rest of my life? Probably not, right? It's very, very expensive. In comparison to Madeira, I would definitely spend more time in Madeira than I would in New York. And I think if you gave New Yorkers the option, they would probably want to spend more time in Madeira than
We
in New
have
York.
here we
So
have here several New Yorkers and they can confirm that.
there you go. So I think it's just the rise of the individual being more autonomous and disconnecting work from geographic location creates an environment where cities can be a real nexus for people that want to live their best lives. A couple cities off the top of my head that I can think about: Lisbon, which is why we're doing the next running remote in Lisbon. I mean,
Yes.
there's obviously been some issues recently where the cost of real estate has absolutely exploded, and the locals are somewhat being taken advantage of to some degree. But Lisbon is an absolute nexus city when you think about people being able to go there, living a good lifestyle, and having access to all of the resources that they need to be able to accomplish not just great work, but also a fantastic life.
Mm.
Other cities, like when you think about Sydney, Australia, very expensive, incredibly stable infrastructure, fantastic internet, great political structure. No one's going to get shot in Sydney, as an example. That's actually, I think, the number. A lot of the surveys for where to work remotely, Sydney is number one in all of those surveys, which is
Wow.
somewhat ironic. Montreal is another one that's really great. That's why I live here,
I loved
and
it actually, yeah.
I love the lifestyle. It's very creative. It has a huge concentration of universities. What I would probably say, any city that wants to do this, Boulder is another example of a smaller city, Colorado, that is amazing in terms of their ability to be able to attract remote workers. So it really boils down to three separate factors. You need a international airport that connects to a hub. So you need to be able to connect to a LaGuardia, New York, or a Toronto Pearson, or a Los Angeles, or a Lisbon, or Mexico City. You need your airport to be able to have daily flights that goes to that particular location. The second thing is you need a university, college or university inside of your city. And you'd be surprised, cities of 100,000 people have colleges or universities inside of them. The reason being is that attracts a lot of that young energy to a core, a urban core. And that's the third thing that you need an active urban core inside of your city where you can go to restaurants, and you can go to your yoga studio, and you can go to your CrossFit classes and all the stuff that remote workers really want. They want that lifestyle, and then they want the cost per square foot for real estate as low as humanly possible. So those are the pieces that you need. It's a relatively simple formula. And if you just implement that, I mean, there are cities that are currently doing this right now that are thinking about the future. What was the one in
Tulsa,
middle America? Pardon?
Tulsa, Tulsa, Vermont are two
Tulsa,
of
yeah,
them.
remote.
Yeah.
Also remote, exactly. So there's a perfect example of a city that's implementing that exact playbook to be able to pull remote workers directly into Tulsa. And I can buy like a 4 bedroom house in Tulsa for 200,000 US,
Yes, I
which
actually
is
interviewed.
go ahead.
No, I actually interviewed Aaron, which started Tulsa with the foundation, and he was at this podcast, and it's incredible which what they created. What people see in the media is the $10,000 they offer for people to move there. Once we
Mhm.
went deeper, what they do is they create a community. So they, of course, take care of co-working spaces, but above all,
Mhm.
they understand that the people factor is the most important thing in the city, no matter
Mm.
where it's located. So after they have these conditions that you mentioned, which Tulsa has, it was like all about building the community, all about building these connections. And the first weeks you arrive to a new place that made people stay longer and made people feel good. And this was very interesting to understand. Everybody saw the money, they did the media with the money, but it was the community that they pushed to make sure that people who moved there actually wanted to stay there forever. Very, very
Right.
interesting. For me, like the Tulsa
Very cool.
remote project is top of the world on what they did. It's absolutely out of this world. And I actually wrote here cool stuff about what you said, because I think what you are saying is that literally the rise of lifestyle cities like Lisbon, cities where
Yes.
you can design your lifestyle, like Tim Ferriss said like 10, 15 years ago, but you can actually now have lifestyle cities. But the question is, what will happen with all these empty offices? Because the prime locations of the city are full of offices. What do you think it should happen? Or how could you transform all this space, and in what?
As of yet unknown, to be completely honest with you, 13% of the US economy is corporate real estate.
Mm-hmm.
13%, right? A lot of those um, spaces are on very long-term leases, 25-year leases. And this is something that I started to kind of discover as I spoke with more people inside of the running remote community and started to speak to people ops people, head of people at very, very large companies. Salesforce Tower in San Francisco cost $1.1 billion. It has 1.2 million square feet, all for Salesforce. It's 10% full right now. It will never be full, ever. Uh, there will be a transformation of those spaces. I think the people that will be left behind will recognize that they really missed the boat, back to your point with regards to community, because Salesforce Tower, if you've ever been down there, if you walk around Salesforce Tower, all the Starbucks are out of business. All of the local infrastructure that supported that labor is now gone. And what I would do is what I'm starting to see a lot of local development projects here in Montreal are doing. Every single new condo building that's going up in the city has a floor of co-working inside of
Mm-hmm.
the condo building. And when you think about that, that's such a smart idea, because not only are you creating community directly inside of your building, but you're just reinforcing all of those neighbors to interact with each other. And since they all basically work from home anyways, you want to be able to create as comfortable an environment as humanly possible for those workers. So you're going to work and you're going to live in that one particular place. So I think repurposing of a lot of that corporate space into condos is probably the direction that I would say we should be going in. But there's a lot of red ink on corporate America's P&Ls for those leases that they are locked into, that they cannot leave, that they are in for 10, 20, 30 years. And right now, they're trying to figure out, it's kind of a weird chicken and the egg issue. It's like no one wants to come to the office, but we want to create connection inside of our organization. But we can only create that connection inside of the organization at the office because we already paid for the office. So we're not willing to get other spaces because we've already paid for this space. and I got some some insider information from a very, very large tech company that stated that their cost to house a worker inside of an office building 20x post COVID because no one wants to actually be in an office building, but they're still renting the infrastructure to be able to do it. So the COO and the CFO is constantly pushing on the head of people saying, dude, you can only meet in spaces that we already own. I'm not going to buy other space, or I'm not going to rent other space for you to be able to go to that space, because that's stupid, because we have a big ass tower that is completely empty and you need to go there. And it just creates this huge problem where, like, but no one wants to go there. So we won't be able to actually create connection with
Yeah.
our workers because no one wants to go to that space. And I don't know how we solve for that problem, but I do know that the workers don't want to go back to the office. 76% of workers state that they want to
Exactly.
be remote more than 3 days per week, right? Like that, all workers. And counterintuitively, actually, that's the same approximate percentage of people that think that state that they are more productive when they work from home. So 76% of workers believe they're more productive when they work from home, and they're right. 67% of managers believe they're less productive when they work from home. So there's like a huge dialect as well that's
Yes.
working in all of these things, where you need to uncouple these pieces to truly figure out how we need to move forward. And untangling those knots is almost, I don't know where to start in
Yeah.
terms of figuring that out, but I can tell you that those workers are entrenched, and corporate America is entrenched because they're tied to their P&L.
Exactly. This is something we saw with LinkedIn's, right? So 20% of the jobs that are remote jobs are getting more than 50% of the applications. So there are way more people wanting to work remotely than the right now available remote positions. And Salesforce is such a cool case because these guys are not joking. They bought a huge farm so they can do retreats in it and always bring people to their farm. I'm not sure if you saw this, but they brought this huge property full of nature where they created micro spaces for meeting and connection. And Salesforce said, instead of
That's
renting, we'll
awesome.
just buy this and keep people coming inside the organization and keep people interested in joining together, but outside this traditional office center in the middle of the big city. These guys are not joking. They're good.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and I'm not saying they're doing it wrong. Like, they acquired Slack. They understand the direction of where
Yes.
the entire workforce is going. But when you have the the harsh realities of, oh, well, we just invested 25 years into the future in terms of, and our vision of the future completely shifted within a month,
Yes.
March of 2020, then it takes a really long time to be able to untangle that. I think the companies that are able to repivot and move towards that new future as quickly as possible will be the net winners. But I think probably this is by far the most dangerous year for remote work, 2023. When I think about
Interesting.
where we could go, where what 2024 will look like, it has been, I am the most unsure of where we'll be in 2024. We could be down to 5% of the US workforce working remotely full time.
True.
We could be there. We could be, as I said before, the 35%, 7% being fully remote. We could see maybe more expansion on the hybrid side. Maybe we could see a pushback. I think the current economy right now is not giving the employee the ability to be able to negotiate in that way. So my gut is that we're actually going to see a further compression of those percentages. And if you had asked me that same question a year ago, I would have said 2024 would have been a growth year for remote work, but it will probably be a compression year for remote work. At
It's
least
gonna
that's my gut feel right now.
it's gonna be interesting because you have both approaches. For one side, you have now the employers with the shrinking workforce, they have a say because they can say, or you come back or you're out. But on the other side, they can cut costs by just closing the offices, some of them at least, not all. So it will be an interesting choice because for many companies, it's a choice. For others, they have leases of 25 years, maybe not so much a choice, but for sure, it will be very, very interesting to see what will happen in the next 2 years. And that's why we returned with this podcast, Liam. That's why we are back.
Right.
Oh, man. I want to change gears a little bit about a new theme that is popping in the workforce, which is the 4-day work week. Left and right, we see new books. Left and right, we see new articles, new experiments. Do you have any opinions about 4-day work week?
I don't have enough information to have an opinion.
Mm,
So I talked to you about this beforehand. Um, I have and again, this is me speaking from a very layman perspective on this subject. I try not to speak out of what I know.
fair.
Um, so I'm going to speak to it, but just take that into consideration. What happens if we propose a 3-day work week? Does that boost productivity? I don't know. Is it that people really weren't working hard in a 5-day work week and now they're switching to a 4-day work week and they're just compressing a 5-day week into a 4-day week? That looks like what's happening. Um, the average worker, I do know this, approximately does about 2.5 to 3 hours of productive work per day, right? In terms of output. And that's like the speed of light law. That's like, you can't really get more than 3 hours of focused work out of a human being per day. That's actually why a lot of these meetings, they kind of fill up their workday with meetings because it's work, but it's not really work because you didn't get
Yes.
anything done, right? You got the plan to get things done put into motion, which you could have done a lot faster. So I I don't know. And then you look at other markets like China.
Oh,
Last time I was
yes.
there, they have a 6-day work week, right? And
A
so
12,
far,
12 hour a day, not just 8 hours a day.
yeah, I
Like, it's
mean,
insane.
and they're working their butts off, and that's their culture. So I think that also the 4-day work week is very cultural in the sense that this is probably, I mean, I'm not necessarily seeing this happen in Asian economies as an
Yeah.
example. It's not happening in Japan. It's not happening in China. Um, so it would be interesting to see if those experiments could be successful in those markets as well. But that's kind of where I'm at right now with regards to the 4-day work week. I'm open to learning a lot more. I think that I really also want to get away from the concept of time as it applies to output because
Mhm.
various different people are much more productive for the same amount of time. There's a lot of variation in output over time. And so what I like to do is analyze, well, if one person is getting twice as much work done in the same amount of time, I want to figure out number one, why? Like, why are they doing that? And what can I learn from that process to be able to tell the other person that's producing half the output in the same amount of time? But then also, um, let's actually just have that person work half as much in terms of time, right?
Yes.
Like I only really want to measure output. That's the only thing that I care about. I don't really care how much time you spend doing something. I care about the output that you produce from that time. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't measure it. I think that measuring time is an important factor as it applies to my previous point, which is analyzing the actual output as it applies to time, because you can figure out insights to be able to tell other team members. But there's an interesting law in the sociology of work. It's called the Face Law. Professor Face came up with this, which is the square root of any organization produces 50% of the output of that organization. So you have 100 employees. The square root of that is 10. Those 10 employees produce 50% of the output for that organization. You take those 10 people and you grab 10 other companies and you grab their 10 most productive people and you put them together in a company. Guess what? 10 people produce 50% of the output. It's the
Wow.
face law. It never changes, right? So a lot of people that I think the 4-day work week makes probably pretty good sense because of this face law. That's not going to change. Whether I go to a 3-day work week, a 2-day work week, I mean, it would be very interesting to be able to test all of these assumptions and
Yes.
see how much you could actually slice down before you would see a market drop in output. But fundamentally, it's just all you need to do is pay attention to that 10%, that square root of individuals, and figure out how to help them maximize their output. So I generally don't pay attention to the middle tier of that organization. That middle tier of the organization is critical. There are a lot of people in a company that produce a meaningful output, but not a exponential output. And what
Yes.
I do is I focus on the people that are putting out exponential output, and I say, okay, well, how can I help you achieve an extra 10% boost in productivity? Because counterintuitively, that actually massively increases the overall output of the organization. Face Law, great stuff. Read his book.
Mm.
It's mind blowing.
That's very interesting. Yeah, as a human, I would say I would prefer to work more days, less hours, because what's happening, for example, in Belgium, they are working 4 days a week. The experiment is 4 days a
Mm-hmm.
week, but 10 hours a day. And one thing that you said, and I feel it
Mm.
in my skin, is I can only work focus for 3 hours in the good day. Let's say 4 hours in the amazing day. So if I have
Mm-hmm.
10 hours or 4 hours of work, it will be more or less the same. While
Mm-hmm.
if I do 5 hours for 5 days, I'll be probably much more productive because my brain still have some juice, That's my feeling about
Yeah,
how
I
I
mean,
work. Maybe not for everyone.
that fires off a red flag for me. You shouldn't be working 10 hours per day. If anything, you should be working less hours per day
Exactly.
because there's a certain amount of output that every human being is capable of per day. And that varies dependent upon the individual, but the amount remains the same. So maybe one person can produce 4 hours of work per day and another person can produce 3 hours of work per day. But regardless of whatever that is, expanding the amount of hours that they work will not increase that overall output. So, what I would suggest that, I mean, the way that I work is sometimes I work Saturday afternoon to
I
kind of
love
crack
it.
open my laptop if I've got time, right, to be able to do something. And the other part of this, too, that is really important to be able to add in is do you like your job or do you not like your job? I like my job. So that's why I would work on a Saturday afternoon because it's fun.
Same.
And if you hate your job, then obviously you're not going to crack open your laptop on a Saturday afternoon. I think that's another big factor that kind of ties into this. And I think the 4 day work week is also presuming that you don't like the work that you're doing.
Yes.
Meaning, if you're purposefully trying to work less, then you don't like it, right? Like, if I want to do something less, then I probably don't like it. As opposed to if I want to do something more, I like it, right?
Yes.
I like my job a lot. I work approximately, well, on a good week, I'll work about 35 hours. And then on a tough week, I'll work 60 hours. And that
Well,
varies dependent upon week to week. Like if I'm getting close to the Running Remote conference, that's when that number would start to ratchet up pretty quickly. But for me, inside of that, I enjoy all of it.
talking of
So I think that,
which,
yeah.
talking of which, we need to close, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about running remote this year. It's going to be another change on the third continent in 3 years, more or less, with some
Yeah,
stop for COVID, the third continent in three
right.
years, in a city that I really like, Lisbon, but mostly because I was
Mhm.
born there. What are your expectations for running remote, and who are you really excited to have? Are you excited to be in Lisbon? Tell me your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a fantastic group of speakers that are going to be presenting this year, and I always say that we have a fantastic group of speakers, but I think that this is going to be the most all-encompassing group where we're going to get a lot of different opinions from a lot of different stakeholders on where remote work is going over the next 18 months. And that I'm very excited about. I just got off a call actually yesterday with David Allen, who
Mm-hmm.
wrote Getting Things Done, which is the archetypal foundational book for the entire personal productivity movement. And he's going to be presenting at Running Remote. And he had a very interesting perspective with regards to self management as it applies to remote work. He believes that remote work is entirely dependent upon self-management, and that the people that are successful remote work are good self-managers. And that'll be an interesting talk. Just his insights on that and how he's been thinking about this over COVID is really interesting. He's coming out with a new book on that subject too.
Mm.
Outside of that, just like really talking with massive companies right now that are back in 2018 when we started the conference, there were less than 5 companies that had more than 1,000 people working remotely that we identified in 2018. Now I don't even know, but we have a couple dozen that are coming to speak that have more than 1,000 workers that are remote, that are coming to the conference. So that's incredibly exciting. And just seeing how we're moving the needle to the point where we're starting to see corporate America or international corporations really adopt remote work at scale is very exciting. I do think, however, this is a make it or break it year for running remote in terms of the direction of remote work. And that's actually stressing me out to some degree because I think a lot of the
Yes.
companies that are coming there are really making a decision to say, are we going to think about this? Are we seriously going to do this remote work thing, or is this a pipe dream? Is this stupid?
I love it. And the roster
So
is
that's stressing me out.
incredible. Yeah, man.
Yeah,
And the
go
lineup
ahead.
is absolutely incredible. I was just saying, like, some companies represented here with their speakers, like Ryan from Slack, HubSpot, Couchsurf will be really cool, actually. Typeform, but also
Mm-hmm.
big ones like Atlassian is thinking on this about a long time. Airbnb, which the CEO Ryan is also very vocal about the complete pivot to remote work and even to digital nomadism. So to be definitely very interesting. Microsoft always kind of trying to be in the forefront, but at the same time going back and forth. I think like the companies represented in this speaker roster, X Team, Ryan from X Team is going to be there. It's like it's insane. It's really be very insightful. Also having like OGs like Lila from Euro, having
Mm-hmm.
of course Git level is represented. I think it's going to be very, very, very interesting as always.
Mm.
But yeah, I'm very excited, and it's going to be my city. So guys, if you come, first you'll have a link in the podcast to get a ticket with a small
Mm-hmm.
discount, and you'll be able to meet all these cool people. And as a running remote third timer this year, one of the coolest thing about running remote, we have all these amazing speakers, but honestly, it's just in conversations that happen around, like the very deep conversation that actually convinced me to come back with the podcast. It's like meeting your heroes in person and having deep discussions everywhere because everybody is looking at the same, everybody has different opinions, and just the conversations that happen in the corridors and the coffee breaks. Those for me are 80% of the value I get from every single running remote. So you guys, you should definitely come. I'll be there. It's in my city. I'll take you for a wine taste if you join us. And Leon, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate the wine tasting as the extra little addition there. If anyone's interested, again, check out the links in the podcast notes, and I'll be very excited to be able to see as many of you as humanly possible come to the event.
Oh, it will happen. Lisbon is a hub for that. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this incredible interview with Liam Martin. If you want to join the conference, runningremote.com is the website. We do have a discount at Nomadex, so just text us to know our discount codes. If you want to join any of our Nomad communities, it may be Caparica, south of Lisbon, or Madeira Island in Nomad Village, maybe Brazil in Pipa, the surf paradise. Just go to nomadex.com. We also run an online Discord server about the Nomad movement, so make sure you join that and have access to everything Nomad. Ask questions. Some of the biggest minds inside the space are there. And the sweetest thing is everything is free, so definitely can't miss this. Be epic. I'll see you here next week with our next guest. It's a fun one, I promise you that, and I'll see you soon.